this is going to be a complex video because there's a lot of pieces to put together concerning the current state of the Ukraine war. But I'm going to start with a brief rundown of the situation on the battlefronts, because of course that continues to drive events. And the first thing to say is that yesterday there were statements from General Tarnavsky, the head of the Tavria group of forces, which of the Ukrainian armed forces, the part of the Ukrainian military that covers the fighting in Zaporozhye region, in the Rabotino-Verbovoye area, but also which is responsible for the defences around Avdiivka. And General Tarnavsky was saying that the situation had stabilised in the Avdiivka area, that the Russians had been held in battles in Tonenka and Berdichi and Orlovka. Well, that was yesterday. Today, we've had more news and we've had more pictures, and the pictures tell a different story. They show that, or at least they appear to show, that the Russians have in fact entered at least the southern part of Orlovka. We're told that they're pushing through the southern part of Orlovka. They will soon control the entirety of the village, which is south of a stream, a small stream that passes through it. Orlovka, I should say, is surrounded by water reservoirs and lakes, and as I said, there's a stream that flows through the village. Some people assume that this stream is a barrier, unless and until we know the size of the stream. I really don't know what the truth is. It could be, and it most likely is, or so it seems to me, a shallow stream which men can probably wade across, though having said that, of course, where there is a stream, there will be a lack of cover. So anyway, the Russians have entered Orlovka, seem to be pushing hard inside the village. We appear to have photographic evidence of this. There's also cascade of reports that the Russians are at least battling inside Tonenka to the south of Orlovka. Earlier reports that they'd captured the village, this particular village, have not been confirmed. In fact, they're almost certainly wrong. But anyway, the Russians do seem to be inside Tonenka as well. And further north, in the Stepovoye, Berdichi area, fighting seems to be taking a very interesting turn. The Ukrainians continue to send some of their best troops, the troops of the 47th Mechanized Brigade, to try to hold Berdichi. And yesterday, when I was discussing the loss of the Abrams tank, of which there have been films circulating around the world, though one social media platform, I'm not going to name it, is apparently trying to block circulation of these photos, which I find bizarre actually, since they're all over the internet. But anyway, I said that it appeared that there was one solitary Abrams tank operating in the Berdichi area. Well, the authorities of the Donetsk People's Republic have corrected that. They say that there were 5. One has been destroyed. There's presumably 4 others. They're all operating in and around Berdichi. The Russians are searching for them. And perhaps, just possibly, quite plausibly, over the next couple of days, we will be getting more pictures of Abrams tanks being burnt up in the fighting there. This episode shows how desperately the Ukrainians are trying to cling on to Berdichi, and it must also suggest, at least it suggests to me, that they're fast running out of Leopard 2 tanks, because Leopard 2s were the tanks that the 47th Mechanized Brigade used to operate. Apparently it's said, given up, these tanks to other brigades, and there are probably not many of them left. And what we have instead is increasing, the 47th Mechanized Brigade appears to have taken Abrams tanks to replace its Leopard 2s. And as I said, it's already lost one, and before long, it's likely to lose more. Anyway, moving on. So lots going on in the Avdiivka area, and clearly the Russians continue to advance in the Avdiivka area. The offensive, the Russian offensive in this place continues. Orlovka probably will be captured within the next few days. Tonenka will be captured within the next few days. The Russians will then push on towards the next improvised line of fortifications. And in the meantime, there are furious comments from Ukrainian commentators and Telegram channels bitterly complaining about the Ukrainian command's failure to create proper fortified lines. There's even apparently satellite photos which have been circulating on Telegram channels, Ukrainian Telegram channels, showing the open fields in which Ukrainian soldiers are being deployed and the complete absence of even the most basic fortifications in them. And that is around Avdiivka. Anyway, that's one important piece of news. As I said, the Russians on the way to gradually capturing Orlovka and probably Tonenka as well. Now, lots of fighting also going on in other places. There's some uncertainty as to the exact situation in Rabotino in the Zaporozhye area. But what I understand has happened is that when it appeared that the Russians were about to overrun Rabotino completely a few days ago, the Ukrainians responded by rushing more reserves to try to hold the positions in Rabotino, a decision I find completely incomprehensible. And I believe it's our old friend Vladimir Rogov who says that they're now trying to entrench themselves in a cemetery close to Rabotino itself and turn that into a fortified area. This is exactly, the Ukrainians continuously do this, cling on to undefendable positions of, in this case, as far as I can see, minimal military value. And as I've discussed previously, the Russian strategy of aggressive attrition, of grinding down Ukrainian forces continues. And this strategy of sending reserves to try to cling on to places like the northern part of Rabotino simply plays into this. I will come shortly to what the Russian Defense Minister, Sergei Shoigu, has to say about all of this. And anyway, turning to other front situation, other battle lines, there are also reports that in the Bakhmut area, the Russians have now control around half of the village of Ivanivska. There's apparently bitter fighting still underway for control of this village. But again, everyone acknowledges that the Russians continue to make progress in Ivanivska. This is a village to the southwest of Bakhmut. And they are continuing to bomb very heavily Chasov Yar. The Russian Air Force is very active in this area, as it is in most parts of the battle lines at the moment. And again, it's only a matter of time before Ivanivska falls and all Ukrainian positions west of the Bakhmut, the Chasov Yar Canal, fall under Russian control. And as has been pointed out, when that happens, after the ground starts to harden in the spring, with Bogdanovka and Ivanivska almost certainly brought under Russian control, and Ivanivska captured, probably the part of Chasov Yar that lies to the east of the canal, captured also. Well, it will become possible at that point for the Russians to launch an assault on Chasov Yar itself, the main town on the other side of the canal, and they might even be able to use armoured forces, apparently, in order to do that. Though the tactics of this, I'm not going to waste time trying to discuss. Anyway, that's another battle that is underway. There is intense fighting, apparently, now underway in Krasnogorovka, the town between Avdiivka and Marinka. The Russians are making a sustained attack on Krasnogorovka. It is being massively bombed by the Russian Air Force. We're getting pictures showing the colossal explosions, these big fab bombs, some of them apparently fab 1,500 bombs, enormous bombs, are doing to this town. Ukrainian positions have been pounded in Krasnogorovka, and the Russians continue their advance into this village, into this town, this small town. It's more than a village, it appears to be a small town. And finishing this brief summary of what's going on, there was a lot of reports this morning, some of them fairly reliable, that in the Liman area, in the Zherebets, along the Zherebets River, the Russians have carried out a sudden offensive and have captured the village of Makeevka. It's one of the bigger villages on the Zherebets River, which has in fact brought them finally to the Zherebets River. If this information is confirmed, and I should say that the Russian Defense Ministry has said absolutely nothing about it up to this point, but if this information is confirmed, then not only have the Russians reached the Zherebets River and are now in control of a village, one of the villages along it, but again we see that the Russians maintain tactical surprise, because all the reports over the last few days spoke of a Russian attack on Terny. Maybe the Ukrainians redeployed their troops to this other village to the south of Makeevka, and instead the main attack seems to have come further north in Makeevka. And of course, if it is indeed the case that Makeevka has fallen, then it's likely that all the other villages on the Zherebets River, the eastern bank of the Zherebets River, will fall under Russian control as well. So that would be dramatic news, but the Russian Defense Ministry has not confirmed it up to this point. Now, the other interesting fact is that the Russian Defense Ministry has not yet confirmed that the Russians control the village of Stepovoye to the northwest of Avdiivka, even though it is universally acknowledged that they do. And the likely explanation for that is that the fighting continues between Stepovoye and Berdichi. The Russian Defense Ministry is very wary of confirming that a particular village has been captured until control of that village has been fully consolidated. And it is likely that when Berdichi falls, the Russians will announce the capture of both Stepovoye and Berdichi at the same time. At least that's my guess. Of course, if the Russians are able to capture Orlovka to the south of Berdichi, then Berdichi, the positions in Berdichi will become, or so it seems to me, from what little I can glean from the map, the Ukrainian positions in Berdichi will become undefendable. Meanwhile, the Russians continue massive shelling, they continue drone attacks, bombing in all sorts of places, all across Ukraine, every day. Every day, Ukraine gets hammered. And now I'm going to touch on certain comments that have been made by the Russian Defense Minister, Sergei Shoigu. He was speaking to a Defense Ministry board meeting in Moscow. He gives these regular updates at the Defense Ministry board. And this one was held supposedly in order to celebrate a holiday for a military holiday, Special Military Operations Day, which Special Operations Forces Day. Anyway, I'm going to skip all of that, and I'm also not going to touch on the many, many other things that he said during this address, relatively brief address by his standards to the military leadership. But he touches on all kinds of things: the situation in Syria, the increase in activities by ISIS in the Middle East, the Russian build-up in the Far East and the deployment of equipment there. He's talked about a lot of those things, but I'm going to focus in this program on his rather brief but rather interesting comments about the situation in the Special Military Operations Zone in Ukraine. He says this: after capturing the important enemy defences in Avdiivka, the Russian group of forces continue to improve the tactical situation in Donetsk and Kupiansk directions, taking new Ukrainian line and positions. Now, when, of course, they talk about improving the tactical situation, what they mean is that the Russians have advanced. So he doesn't give many details, but we'll see what he goes on to say. Since the beginning of the year, about 327 square kilometers of territory of the new regions of the Russian Federation have been liberated in all directions. Over the past week, Pobeda, Lastochkino, the Russians spell it Latochkino, interesting, and Severnoye have been liberated from the enemy. So these are the three villages that he mentions. Pobeda, of course, is in the Marinka area, but Lastochkino and Severnoye, as we know, are in the Avdiivka area. He doesn't mention Stepovoye, so we'll see when he does. And then he goes on to say, in other directions, the Russian troops continue to deliver powerful strikes at Ukrainian objects, not allowing the enemy to regain combat readiness. As a result of decisive and steadfast actions of our servicemen, the Ukrainian military are losing their combat potential. On average, since the beginning of the year, the enemy has lost more than 800 troops and 120 units of various hardware, including foreign-made weapons, every day. Over the course of the special military operation, the Ukrainian armed forces have lost up to 444,000 men. After the failure of the counter-offensive efforts, the Ukrainian command attempts to stabilize the situation and prevent the deterioration of the front lines by remaining reserves. The joint group of forces eliminates the enemy reserves by precision weaponry, not allowing the Ukrainian military to redeploy forces to the line of contacts, thwarting attempts to launch counterattacks at our positions. And then he rounds up and finishes, overall, this demonstrates the futility of the US strategy to contain Russia at the expense of Ukrainian lives and large-scale military and economic support of the Kiev regime. We will continue to fulfill the tasks of the special military operation set by the Supreme Commander-in-Chief, that's to say Putin, until its objectives are achieved. Now, notice again, no mention here of the word offensive. The Russians are not, as far as they're concerned, conducting an offensive. At the moment, it remains aggressive attrition. It might look like an offensive in the area of Avdiivka it clearly is now a developing offensive. But the overall strategy continues to be aggressive attrition. The Ukrainian military are losing combat potential. This is what Shoigu says. Since the beginning of the year, they have lost more than 800 men and 120 units of various hardware every day. Over the last couple of weeks, as I've been saying, it's been over 1,000 a day. But of course, he's taking us back to the start of the year. And he says overall, during the entire period of the special military operation, the armed forces of Ukraine have lost up to 444,000 troops. That's dead and wounded, which is, of course, his figure. President Zelensky, as we know, has given a rather different one. I would say that Dima at the Military Summary Channel, who has been putting together all the casualty figures that the Russian Defense Ministry reports every day, has noticed a 4,000-man discrepancy in these losses. He has noticed that Shoigu is claiming that the Ukrainians have lost 444,000 men. Dima has tabulated from the Russian Defense Ministry's figures a total of 440,000 men. I'm going to suggest that the 4,000 men, the extra 4,000 men that Ukraine has lost, that Shoigu is referring to, at least these are the Russian claims, that they are the people who Ukraine has lost in Avdiivka. This is the sum total of Ukrainian losses in Avdiivka, at least during the recent period of the fighting there. I've seen some astonishing numbers being thrown about of Ukrainian losses in the Avdiivka area. I think they're far too high. I've said that the Russians, however, over a certain period in the fighting around Avdiivka, stopped giving reports about what was going on there. They decided to observe operational secrecy about the fighting in Avdiivka, and I suspect that it is from these numbers that we get the extra total of 4,000 men, rounding it all up to 444,000. Anyway, that's my guess. But we stress again, it continues to be aggressive attrition. And he talks about how the Ukrainian command attempts to stabilize the situation and prevent the deterioration of the front by remaining reserves. And we've seen that. We've seen how the Ukrainians have rushed forces to Avdiivka, to Rabotino, to Kupiansk, to all of these places, which is exactly what the Russians want them to do. That the purpose of the Russians is to prevent the Ukrainians finding their balance. The Russian military continues to eliminate the reserves through precision strikes, and these are events like that missile attack on Selidovo that we talked about a short time ago. And he then goes on to say that this grinding down continues and that the Ukrainian forces, as a result, continue to be systematically and relentlessly depleted. So it remains aggressive attrition. The main offensive blow has still to come. So I just wanted to say that because there's been some discussions of Shoigu's words, but I don't think anybody has read them properly or fully. To me, their meaning is absolutely clear. The big offensive blow has yet to come. So that's the situation on the battle lines. Now, yesterday in my programme, I discussed that there was clearly a mood of panic starting to build, and in Western capitals, especially European capitals. I speculated that one of the reasons was the situation on the battlefronts, which is continuing to deteriorate, and I also speculated that another reason might be that extraordinary article in the New York Times, which might be giving rise to concerns that the US intelligence establishment might be on the brink of pulling out or reducing its footprint in Ukraine, and that might be causing not just the Ukrainians, but the Europeans to start to panic. And I'm going to say that over the last 24 hours, news has poured in which, to all intents and purposes, as far as I'm concerned, reinforces both those theories. Now, let's first of all begin about whether or not there was indeed a panic yesterday. And I've been reading more and more reports from all sorts of places using expressions like despair, concern, desperation, dejection, all of that kind of thing. Most important of all, the Polish president, Andrzej Duda, says that part of the meeting in Paris was heated, that there was angry words exchanged, in other words, and it appears that the main discussion point over the course of this meeting was Macron's harebrained plan to deploy for the EU to send troops to Ukraine. And we've now had a string of statements from various Western countries, all saying that they have no plans to do that. We've had comments to this effect from Germany, from Poland, from Spain, from Italy, from the United States, and from Britain. All of them together basically saying that they have no plans to send troops to Ukraine. The statements have varied in terms of how categorical they are, saying that you have no plans at the moment to send troops to Ukraine might, of course, mean that you could change your plans at some future time and decide to send your troops to Ukraine. So this idea, which has been taboo up to now, has not been fully dropped, but at any rate, one gets the sense, very much the sense, from the vehemence of some of the comments and the implicit criticism of Macron that he's floating of this disastrous idea at this particular time was unwelcome, and that there is deep anger across the West with Macron for bringing it up specifically now. And I would also add that one of the effects of this Macron initiative is that it has led to admissions starting to circulate that there are indeed Western special forces operating in Ukraine. We've all known that for a very, very long time, but it was not something that Western governments particularly wanted to disclose, but now it's been confirmed. And of course, the Russians have been saying it for months. But anyway, there it is. There are Western special forces in Ukraine. This doesn't, of course, take into account the large numbers of so-called advisors, private contractors in Ukraine who most probably are there, are former serving military, given early discharge from NATO militaries, and then sent to Ukraine, where they carry out various tasks nominally as private contractors. I've discussed this in earlier videos, as have many other people. So this whole row over the deployment of forces took place. Every European government knows what a sensitive issue it is within their own countries. They don't want it to be talked about now. I would add, by the way, even the Scandinavian countries, Finland and Sweden, have strongly ruled it out. And by the way, it has also provoked something of a political row in France with French MPs in the National Assembly, all furious about this, and and Marine Le Pen, the perennial right-wing candidate for the French presidency, who's looking increasingly strongly positioned at the moment to gain election in 2027. She's come out predictably and has condemned it as well. However, it's now clear that what is triggering the panic is not just a sense that Ukraine's defences are crumbling, but also alarm that the underlying condition of the Ukrainian army is becoming increasingly critical. And there's been a long, agonised, furious discussion about ammunition. And there's been lots of criticism from various Western governments, European governments, that up to now France has been preventing the new cunning plan that some European leaders are coming up with, which is to go abroad and buy shells on the international arms market, particularly in Africa and amongst the Arab states. And I spoke about how recently the Czech president, Petr Pavel, has spoken about the fact that there's supposedly 500,000 shells, 155mm shells, which could be available for purchase in presumably the Middle East and Africa, and 300,000 122mm shells. And Der Spiegel had a piece about how Germany is also trying to buy shells in international arms, through international arms purchases, and that they've managed to find a package of 170,000 120mm shells that they're going to supply to Ukraine. Though it must be said that up to this point in time, the very latest German arms package to Ukraine only mentions 14,000 shells, which is just a few days of shells for Ukraine. President Zelensky, by the way, on this issue of shells, has now come forward and said that the European Union not only failed to supply Ukraine with 1 million shells, as it promised in March last year, but its claim that it has supplied Ukraine with 500,000 shells is false. The actual number of shells that the European Union has supplied to Ukraine is no more than 300,000. 300,000 out of the 1 million that they promised. And no one has come forward to contradict him on this, so it is most likely true. And it is clear that shell production in the European Union is still stuck, apparently, at the total of around 4 to 6,000 rounds of 155mm shells a month, which doesn't come anywhere close to fulfilling Ukraine's needs. So, reports now circulating that Ukraine will run out of shells in June at current levels of use. This could be sooner, especially if the situation heats up on the battlefronts, which it might very well do, by the way. And air defense missiles are apparently going to start to run out or become critically short as early as late March. So March, we're looking at shortages of air defense missiles. June, we're looking at shortages, critical shortages of shells. Now, in terms of shells, Macron has been resisting, apparently, demands from European states that as they go to the international arms market to buy the shells there. And it's clear that after the debacle of his meeting in Paris, he's attempted to cobble together a European army to send to Ukraine. A humiliated Macron has now agreed to this plan. And Ursula von der Leyen, European Commission President, has now come forward and has come up with another brilliant idea, which is that the European Union uses the interest from the Russian frozen assets, which they have now appropriated. They've not been able so far to seize the assets themselves, but they are able to get at least some of the interest. And she's suggesting that the European Union uses the proceeds of this interest to go abroad, presumably, and start buying weapons for Ukraine on the international arms market, buying shells and other weapons in that kind of way. Now, I'm going to make a few comments about this because it is an idiot plan. The first thing to say is that it confirms a suspicion I have long had, which is that though every leader, every government of the West now claims to be committed to the concept of free markets, they don't actually understand how free markets work. We saw that with the oil price cap idea, which has had no effect at all, so far as anyone could see, on the sale of Russian oil on global markets. Even the West has bought Russian oil at more than the cap. And this latest plan is another example of this. Speaking as someone, whose roots very firmly are in the old social democrat political movements, which basically, don't exist anymore, but which was sceptical of free markets, I find it astonishing that the leaders of today, who are all supposedly fervid supporters of free markets, clearly don't understand how free markets actually work. Now, the thing to understand about this is that there is a finite number of shells at any one point in time available on the international arms market. And when I say the international arms market, that of course includes governments in the Middle East and in Africa. If we are buying shells from them, we are in effect trading them, so it becomes part of the international arms trade. Now, if you have money and you are in urgent need of a product that is in limited supply, then if you go to the market to buy that product, what you are inevitably going to find is that there is going to be a very significant increase in price. So you might come with 1.5 billion euros, which is a number that I've seen some suggest. You might come up with rather more than that. You might come up with more money than that. But what you're going to find is that the people who you deal with, the arms traders, the arms dealers, the African and Middle East governments, assuming they are prepared to sell to you at all, And bear in mind that some of these governments in the Middle East and Africa are friends of Russia. Egypt, for example, is a major friend of Russia. It's joining the BRICS. Its major supplier of wheat is Russia. They probably won't want to argue or quarrel with the Russians, especially given that the Russians are now investing heavily in the Egyptian economy and are talking about building an industrial park in Egypt. Anyway, other Arab, Middle Eastern, African governments, they'll probably say to themselves, well, the Europeans need all these shells. We're not really engaged in this quarrel between the Europeans and the Ukrainians, but the Europeans are clearly desperate. So this is a good opportunity for us to make money by raising the price of our shells, assuming, of course, we are prepared to sell them at all. And of course, in any transactions involving shells, there are bound to be all sorts of middlemen and arms dealers and people like that floating around. They will know that the European Union is coming with large amounts of cash by the standards of these sort of transactions. They will be buzzing right now, right across the entire international arms trade. There will be people talking to each other. They will be speaking about the enormous cash bonanza that is coming their way. And of course, they will all be working in order to drive a very, very hard bargain. What the Europeans are going to find is that they're going to get some shells, but the shells that they will get are fewer than they expect, and they will come at a very high price. Some of these shells will be 122 millimeter shells. Some of them will be shells which must have been supplied to countries in the Middle East and in Africa by the former Soviet Union, or perhaps by its East European allies. I say that because General Pavel was talking about 300,000 122 millimeter shells that might be bought. 122 millimeter is a Soviet Russian caliber, so these would have to be either Soviet or Russian or East European shells. And if they are old or decades old, they will probably not be in the best condition. And again, if you go to the international arms market, if you go to the Middle East and you buy shells in places like that, you can forget about quality control. You will no doubt get all kinds of assurances that the shells are in perfect and usable condition. But you would be a fool if you assumed that that was so. And given that you're desperate to buy these shells, you will probably find that you're buying all kinds of shells which turn out to be duds. There are already, I remember reading in the Western media, lots of complaints from Ukrainian soldiers that they are already getting shells from the West which turn out to be duds. So that is going to be a massive bonanza for people in the Middle East, in Africa, in the international arms trade, a dodgy trade at the best of times, as one can easily imagine. A lot of people are going to become extremely rich out of all of this. It is not going to solve Ukraine's problems with shells. In fact, if Ukraine gets a medley of shells from all kinds of different sources, many of them apparently, presumably in poor condition, some of them outright duds, it might even make Ukraine's situation more complicated. and in some ways worse. And of course there's the other problem, because you get shells, perhaps shells not in particular good condition, but shells are one thing, artillery pieces is something else. And it's quite extraordinary that Western governments, European governments, don't seem to understand that shells are only useful if they can be fired by guns. And the West, the Europeans have run out of guns. Denmark, Britain have, to all intents and purposes, already supplied practically their entire artillery arsenal, their entire arsenal of artillery pieces. France, well, it's not quite so bad there. In Germany, it's not quite so bad there, but they've got few to produce. And in France, we were told recently that they managed to reduce the time for the building of a Caesar howitzer from 3 years to 15 months, which already seems astonishingly long for a single artillery piece. And of course, there's also the problem of barrels. And here there's been some very interesting information. The Russians have apparently hugely increased the production of gun barrels so that their guns can have replacement barrels when the barrels wear out. And bear in mind, some of the older Russian guns, the D-20 howitzers, operate at lower pressures than Western guns, so barrel wear will be less of a problem anyway. And of course, the Russians have secure supply chains and secure communication lines. So all of this doesn't seem to be well understood amongst Western governments, European governments. They don't understand very much about how the markets work. They certainly don't understand how the arms market works. And they don't understand very much about artillery either. It's a plan that is going to lose an awful lot of money, some of which arguably is not even theirs if it comes from the accrued interest of Russian assets that they, for the moment, can't seize. So, as I said, it's not perhaps, might be an expensive plan, but it's going to result in a lot of money. But it is not going to solve Ukraine's underlying shell problem. It might stretch it out for a few weeks and months, but it can't substitute for proper, stable production of shells. And the fact that they're coming up with plans like this strongly suggests that the Europeans have basically given up on that idea. And of course, they've cobbled together what they call a missile coalition. But of course, that isn't going to solve their problems. We've already been here before. There was supposed to be a missile coalition, air defense missile coalition, put together last year, and that hasn't worked either. So, there we are. A shell coalition scrounging around the international arms market to buy shells. And all of this driven by growing panic that Ukraine is running out of weapon systems, is running out of shells, and of course it is running out of men. It is becoming increasingly short of manpower, and of course you can't buy men. If Ukraine doesn't have them, then of course it can't fill its ranks, and the mobilization law has already shrunk in terms of its scope in Ukraine, and there are major legal obstacles to trying to force Ukrainians who've come to Europe to return to Ukraine to fight in the Ukrainian army. If that happens, by the way, the European Union is in a very dark place in terms of its own human rights laws. Anyway, there we go. So that's part of the cause for the panic, a sense that things are not going well on the battlefronts, but that Ukraine's army is now desperately short of everything, and Europe simply cannot make up the difference. Its own arms industries have failed. That's now generally understood. The idea of sending troops to Ukraine has been floated, but it is perceived by many as a disastrous one, and there's understanding of how negatively that will be perceived by the European public. And on top of that, there are now growing rumours that there is now a crisis, a political crisis festering in Ukraine. I spoke earlier in the programme about how Ukrainian commentators are furious with their own military for the failure to create proper, reliable defences west of Avdiivka. And the Ukrainian government is now taken to saying that the Russians, it's always the Russians, are planning a Maidan 3 sometime in May. This is, of course, when President Zelensky's term formally runs out. He's going to try to remain president beyond the expiry of his term by passing a mobilization law which precludes elections. That might not be fully acceptable in Ukraine if the situation on the battlefronts continues to deteriorate, as it plausibly will do. Then, of course, it's not impossible that all of these fears and concerns that are circulating about a major political crisis in Kiev, that they will all come to a head sometime around May, especially given that there are also reports that it is around May that the Russians are planning to launch their big offensive, maybe in Kupiansk, Kharkiv region, storming the city of Kharkiv itself. So one can see one cause for the panic, but there is the other one, and that is about the Americans. Now, there continues to be political deadlock in the United States about support for Ukraine. Yesterday, President Biden summoned to the White House all the congressional leaders, and he appears to have put enormous pressure on Speaker Johnson to try to get him to agree to the appropriations package for Ukraine. And this is now being linked to the danger of a government shutdown in April. And unsurprisingly, but I suspect to the anger of many Republicans, Mitch McConnell weighed in to support President Biden, something which I suspect, by the way, will in time undermine his position as the leader of the Republicans in the Senate. It's important to remember that the package on border control that McConnell cobbled together, it was McConnell, even though he hid behind someone else, was overwhelmingly rejected by Republicans. And when the appropriations bill, the standalone appropriations bill for funding for Ukraine, Taiwan, and Israel was presented to Congress, 2/3 of the Republicans in the Senate refused to support it. So McConnell backing Biden on this issue is McConnell going way out on a limb and making many enemies within the Republican Party. But anyway, for the moment at least, Speaker Johnson continues to stand his ground. He's made it absolutely clear that he is not prepared to put the package as it stands to the House of Representatives, that border control remains the priority, and that the President is not putting forward remotely acceptable plans for Republicans on the issue of border control. And on that issue, I think Speaker Johnson has the support not just of most of the representatives, the members of the Republican Party in the House, but also most of the Republican electorate and large numbers of people across the United States who are not Republicans. So the deadlock continues. Beyond that, Janet Yellen has now come out and spoken about her support, her continued support for the seizure of Russian sovereign assets. We've seen that the G7 statement that came out a few days ago didn't, in fact, allow for this, but we've had comments and acknowledgement from the administration that in order to seize Russian sovereign assets in the United States, putting aside all questions of international law, there would first have to be a vote by Congress authorizing it. Again, there's probably, in fact, there definitely is a majority for this in Congress, but why at this particular moment in time would Republicans want to help Biden with this particular issue? Well, we'll see. Probably at some point a vote will take place. Probably at some point there will be a vote on funding for Ukraine. But for the moment at least, there is deadlock in Congress on all of these issues. But, of course, it's not just Congress. Various people, Brian Valetic most pertinently, has pointed out that this whole thing, this whole story of appropriations by Congress is a red herring because there simply isn't enough equipment. There aren't enough weapons in the US arsenal. Shells and, of course, especially air defense missiles to provide for Ukraine and for other US allies as well. There are reports that the Taiwanese government is beginning to become increasingly restless and concerned and is starting to question why the United States is focusing so heavily on Ukraine and is neglecting Taiwan, which is, of course, also feeling that it is being manoeuvred into the firing line, if you like, in this ongoing conflict between the United States and China. So, there are those problems. But also, Republicans and many people across the United States, to a far greater extent than is acceptable in Europe, can see the situation in Ukraine itself, can understand that the writing is on the wall. Now, I should say there's been much more comment and much more discussion over the last few days about that extraordinary article in the New York Times about US intelligence operations against Russia from Ukraine. I'm going to, by the way, be particularly careful in my choice of words in this section of this video. There have been sensitivities expressed, or at least indicated, and I'm not going to cross them, so I hope that my words will nonetheless be clear. But anyway, there's been concerns that this article, there's been growing concerns expressed that this article, which makes some astonishing revelations and gives away a great deal of information that would normally be classified, that this article basically indicates that the United States intelligence community is preparing to pull out of Ukraine, that it's preparing to pull out its key assets and operations out of Ukraine. And the Ukrainians appear to be very alarmed about this. It's now been confirmed that the CIA director, William Burns, rushed to Kiev on Thursday, where he had meetings with top Ukrainian officials. And apparently, the purpose of his visit was to try to soothe the Ukrainians and to reassure them that they're not actually being abandoned and left hanging out to dry. And the last is important because the article basically, even whilst confirming that the Americans and the Ukrainians were joined at the hip in all the things that happened, goes on to repeatedly blame the Ukrainians for all the extraordinary activities that the Ukrainians were conducting in the Donbass and inside Russia, the murders, the assassinations, all of those sort of things. One is left with a really bizarre impression, if you read this article, that the Americans were shocked, upset, repeatedly, time after time after time. As the Ukrainians did all of these things, the Americans would wag their finger at them, tell them, you mustn't do this again, it's most improper, it's completely wrong. The Ukrainians would then just go on doing it, and then the Americans would just go along with it and say, that the Ukrainians are really out of control, and they would wag their fingers a little more, but still the whole thing carried on as always. Matt Taibbi on Substack, by the way, has written a brilliant piece about this very strange alibi. But the Ukrainians must be feeling that they really are being left hanging out to dry. And one person who's clearly very annoyed is the Ukrainian intelligence chief, Kirill Budanov, because there's a whole little account about an operation which he was involved in Crimea. We're told that the Americans thought that this operation was a disaster, that there was anger expressed about it. Budanov himself is unlikely to see it in those terms. He must be reading this article, and he must be, understandably, extremely angry that he has been outed and exposed in this way. And when I say exposed, let me just make one observation of my own on this point. Yesterday, I received an absolutely fascinating email from someone which gave me a very, very interesting list of various operations that have been carried out as part of this team that was established by the Americans and the Ukrainians in Ukraine. Some of these operations post-date, by the way, the start of the special military operation. And I would add that this person, who I am confident is providing me with absolutely correct information, by the way, was extremely careful to provide me links to open sources in which the effects of some of these operations is disclosed. But I'm not going to say anything about them. I mean, I've seen the list, and some of it is eye-watering stuff, by the way. And as I said, I come back to what I said. I still think that it is accurate, and despite it being so eye-watering. But I'm not going to actually discuss what is in this list. And there's two reasons for this. Firstly, doing so would again provide information which might make it possible for people watching this video to identify the source. And I don't want to do that. I don't want to put anybody in a potentially embarrassing situation. But some of these operations are presumably still classified, and I just don't think it's appropriate, even despite my very strong disapproval of these operations, to say anything about them. And yet, we've had a whole article in the New York Times, which is publishing information which the Ukrainians must have assumed would remain confidential, and information indeed about Kirilo Budanov himself. So, Budanov is angry, and we can see an example of this. He is now going off-piste. He's starting to say things that are embarrassing to the Americans. For example, he's given an interview in which he's supported the claim from the Russian authorities that Alexei Navalny had a natural death. By the way, I've come to the view that Budanov on this is absolutely right. It's now universally acknowledged that Navalny was about to be involved in a prisoner's swap. There's going to be a complicated swap whereby the Russians were going to release Navalny together with two American journalists, or rather two Americans they hold, presumably Whelan and Gershkovich, in return from one of their own agents, a man called Krasikov, who the Russians have all but admitted carried out an assassination on their orders and who's held in Germany. So given that the Russians clearly want to get Krasikov back, Putin clearly wants to get Krasikov back. He discussed this in his interview with Tucker Carlson. I can't see why the Russians would wreck this swap by murdering, just before it happens, one of the people who was supposed to be involved in it, who is Navalny himself. But anyway, that's another issue, one perhaps to be discussed in a little more detail in a future programme. The point is, Budanov coming along and saying that Navalny died of natural causes contradicts what US officials, people in the West, all sorts of people have been trying to say over the last couple of days. I read an article, for example, in the Financial Times just a few days ago by Martin Sandbu, in which he discussed Navalny's death and spoke of Navalny's murder at the orders of President Putin as a fact. And here comes Budanov, and he says this is all not true. Budanov died of Navalny died of natural causes, just as the Russians say he did. Well, Budanov said other things too, which I'm sure that the Americans are not going to be pleased about. He said that, for example, Putin's government is stable and fully in control, and nobody should expect it to fall by itself. And he also made threats again against the Crimean Bridge. By the way, and in parenthesis, this is becoming a stale topic now. The Russians will undoubtedly take measures to defend the Crimean Bridge, but we've had a cascade of reports now that since the failure of Ukraine's summer offensive, the Russians, now in confident control of their land bridge to Crimea, have almost finished work on road and railway links by land to Crimea, making it possible to continue to supply Crimea with pretty much everything it needs, irrespective of what happens to the Crimean Bridge. I'm not saying that they won't want to defend the Crimean Bridge. But anyway, Budanov clearly, along with these threats, I suspect the threat of the Crimean Bridge was intended as the pretext for this interview. The fact that he's contradicting the Americans, or at least the common American line, the common Western line, on Navalny. To me, it looks like an indicator of how angry he is. And not just angry, but clearly concerned that the Americans are indeed pulling out and that the Ukrainians could soon be left hanging out to dry. But of course, it won't just be the Ukrainians who will be left hanging out to dry, because if the Americans do start to pull out from Ukraine, even if they do so step by step, starting with some of their intelligence assets and then moving on to other things, then the Europeans will be left out on a limb also. And that, of course, explains the panic. Yesterday's panic, which I suspect the worst of it is now over, but the concerns that underpin it still continue. Well, I'm going to finish my video by just touching on a few more points. Firstly, Jack Rasmus, who is a academic, I think he's retired academic, notable left-wing writer. He's done a masterly piece putting together all the factors in the war, the extent to which the Russians have outproduced Ukraine, and the extent to which this means that the war, in effect, in terms of Ukraine, is all but lost. The second point I'm going to make is a personal one, and it goes back to this massive intelligence operation that the Americans have been conducting in Ukraine alongside the Ukrainians. I said in a video that I made 2 days ago how this will have deeply alarmed and angered the Russians, and in fact the article speaks of a meeting between Putin and his intelligence chiefs in 2021 in which they complained to him about what was going on in Ukraine. But there is another point which I don't think anybody has made, but it is touched on to some extent in Jack Rasmus's article, which is what did this operation in the end achieve? It produced a certain amount of intelligence, which turned out to be wrong, which created a political crisis in the United States following the 2016 election, giving spice to allegations of collusion, which subsequently turned out to be untrue, and which multiple investigations were unable to corroborate. It caused anger in Russia and was undoubtedly seen by Russians as confirming that the situation in Ukraine was a threat to themselves. It resulted in various James Bond type activities, which the Americans say they disapprove of. Well, what in the end was achieved? The big story of this entire conflict, the single biggest story, is the extent to which the United States, its intelligence community, got Russia completely wrong. They massively underestimated the size, diversity, sophistication, and flexibility of the Russian economy. They launched an economic war against it as a result, which has failed utterly. They completely underestimated the resilience of the Russian military and the solidity of Putin's government. Alex Christoforou and I have discussed in many places how this constitutes the biggest single intelligence failure since the Second World War. So, surely it would have been better if the United States, its intelligence community, had been more focused on intelligence gathering, piecing together real facts about Russia, its economy, its society, its political system, its industrial base, its technology base, those kind of things, instead of getting involved in these covert operations which have achieved nothing except infuriate the Russian bear. That's the second point I want to make. And the third point is I want to draw attention to what I think is one of the greatest tweets about the Ukraine war made by anyone, which has been made by David Sachs. And I'm going to read it out. He says this: "The war in Ukraine is based on lies, lies about how it started, how it's going, and how it will end. We are told that Ukraine is winning, when in fact it is losing. We are told that the war makes NATO stronger, when in fact it is depleting it. We are told that Ukraine's biggest problem is a lack of funds from the United States Congress, when in fact the West can't produce enough ammunition, a problem that will take years to fix. We are told that Russia is suffering greater casualties, when in fact Ukraine is running out of soldiers, another problem money can't fix. We are told that the world is with us, when in fact the global majority believe US policy is the height of folly. We are told that there is no opportunity to make peace, when in fact we have rejected multiple opportunities for a negotiated settlement. We are told that if Ukraine keeps fighting, it will improve its negotiating position, when in fact the terms will only get much worse than what was already available and rejected. Nevertheless, the lies will succeed in dragging out the war. Congress will appropriate more funds. Russia will take more territory. Ukraine will mobilize more young men and women to feed into the meat grinder. Discontent will mount. Eventually, there will be a crisis in Kiev, and the Zelensky government will be toppled. And then, when the war is finally lost, when the whole country lies in smouldering ruins on a funeral pyre of their own making, the liars will say, well, we tried. Having prevented any alternative, having smeared anyone who told the truth as puppets for the enemy, the liars will say, we did our best. We stood up to Putin. In fact, they will claim we would have succeeded, but for the fifth column of Putin apologists who stabbed the Ukrainians in the back. Then, having shifted blame and patted themselves on the back, they will blithely move on to the next war, as they moved on to Ukraine after their disasters in Afghanistan and in Iraq. The lies are comprehensive, but they will work. I have to say, I find that one of the most powerful, one of the most moving, one of the most humane, and one of the most correct statements anyone has made over the course of this war. I am speechless reading it. I have nothing further to say. This is where I end my program for today. More from me soon. Let me repeat again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. Don't forget to check out our shop. Get yourself the amazing things that you will find there. Our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.